All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Nicole Peterson. I'd like to thank you for joining us for our SMA INSS PRISM speaker session entitled Defense Strategy or a Strategy of Denial. I'd also like to thank today's speaker, Mr. Elbridge Colby, for taking the time to present today. Before we get started, though, we're going to have a few quick housekeeping items. So we'll be having a Q&A session at the conclusion of today's brief. During the presentation or during the Q&A, go ahead and submit your questions through ZoomGov's chat function. It's a chat icon at the bottom bar of your screen. Also, go ahead and submit all of your questions today to Mariah Yeager. Her name should be listed as questions-Mariah Yeager. And questions that aren't submitted to Mariah specifically may not be addressed, so please make sure to send those questions to Mariah. Also note that your name is going to appear in the chat before your question, and it'll be read out loud before we address that question. If you prefer for your name to not be recorded and on the record, go ahead and rename yourself by going to participants at the bottom bar of your screen, then more next to your name, and finally rename. Also, make sure to keep your video and audio off for the duration of this event if you're in the audience. Those who don't do so will be removed from the event. So now I'm going to briefly turn the floor over to Mr. Michael McCloudzik, a INSS Senior Fellow at NDU and the Editor-in-Chief of its PRISM Journal, to kick off today's event. So Mr. McCloudzik, over to you.
Thank you very much, Nicole. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining us at this session of the NDU PRISM Speaker Series, hosted by our partners at the Strategic Multi-Layer Assessment. This series seeks to tease out the most vexing emerging challenges to our national security, focusing this year specifically on great power competition, geoeconomics, and emerging disruptive technologies. It's said that tactics without strategy is the noise before defeat. We in the United States produce a multitude of strategies in every administration: the national security strategy, the national defense strategy, the national military strategy, counter-narcotics strategy, counter-cyber strategy. And yet it's also said that we haven't really had a grand strategic paradigm since containment. Our distinguished speaker today is Elbridge Colby. From 2017 to 2018, Elbridge served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy and Force Development. In that role, he served as the lead official in the development and rollout of the department's preeminent strategic planning guidance, the 2018 National Defense Strategy, or the NDS, which shifted the Department of Defense's focus to the challenges to the United States military posed by China in particular, followed by Russia, and prioritizing restoring the joint forces' warfighting edge against these major power competitors. He also served as the primary Defense Department representative in the development of the 2017 National Security Strategy. From 2018 to 2019, Ridge was the director of the defense program at the Center for a New American Security, where he led the center's work on defense issues. Today, he's the principal and co-founder of the Marathon Initiative, which aspires to develop the diplomatic, military, and economic strategies the nation will need to navigate a protracted competition with great power rivals. And he's also the author of The Strategy of Denial, American Defense in an Age of Great Power Conflict, published last year by Yale University Press. Ridge will speak for approximately 45 minutes, after which he'll respond to your questions and comments as you provide them in the Zoom chat space until we're done. With that, Ridge, are you ready?
I am. Thank you. Thanks a lot, Mike, and thanks to SMA and NDU for the kind invitation. It's great to be with this group. Actually, it's a particular pleasure. Somewhat surprisingly, I've been promoting my book, The Strategy of Denial, and I know this is a government line, so it's not promoting, but just this, my book. And I've been doing a lot of talks in this sort of foreign policy and kind of broader policy discussion, and less actually with this sort of defense professionals. So it's really a great opportunity to be able to engage via NDU, which is, of course, where so much of the highest level thinking and is going on in the kind of professional military world. And so it's really, actually, that's one of the things I really hope to do with my book, is to kind of catalyze and sort of advance, hopefully, the discussion within that community. And I mean, I'll just kind of start out with sort of an overview of the book, but really looking forward to the discussion more than anything else, especially as people may have seen what I'm arguing in other venues. But actually, the book does really come out of my experience working on the National Defense Strategy of 2018, and I'm biased, but I do think we at least tried to initiate some significant change to at least get a little more strategic as a nation, certainly as a defense establishment at that point, others to judge how well that was done. But my experience of that strategy led me to think that there was actually a real need, not only kind of for a strategy, but for a full scope explanation of the logic that, at least in my mind, lies behind it. And I think it seems continues to undergird, hopefully, what the Defense Department is trying to move towards. That there were a lot of people, civilians, uniforms, political appointees, civil servants, who grappled with elements of the problem, but nobody had gone to the trouble, actually, in a very long time to write really a defense strategy book. Like, we have a defense strategy. We have, I think, Mike, you made the point about tactics being noise. We've had a lot of operational military analyses by the FFRDCs, by think tanks, obviously within the military establishment, and those, are trying to grapple with problems within a given scope. And then on the other hand, we've had a lively sort of what you might think of as grand strategy debate over the last generation. Robert Kagan, John Mearsheimer, Joe Nye, name your famous person, Richard Haas, et cetera. But actually, defense strategy is a particular thing that exists between those two things, which is we have a grand strategy, but then that translates into the employment, the posturing, the development of military forces that are eventually used in an operational way. You should have some idea of why you're going to buy X number of F-35s or not, or you're going to buy submarines rather than carriers or what have you. And that, we were trying to do out of the NDS of 2018, but actually there wasn't really nobody kind of sketched out the entire elephant. So that was my ambition in trying to do this, and obviously for others to judge. And of course, the motivating problem that sort of motivated us in the strategy, and certainly motivated me in writing this book, was our legacy post-Cold War, not post-1945, post-1991 defense strategy was basically one of, if there's a threat somewhere in the world, if we put our mind to it realistically, we'll be able to take care of it and hold down the fort in another theater. So the famous bottom-up review of, I think it was 1993, 94, which was a very strategic document, that created the simultaneity standard for the military. But basically, the simultaneity standard for the military says, well, if we get into war somewhere else, nothing really that bad is going to happen because we'll have plenty of forces to be able to deal with it. And given the threats that existed at that time, that was a perfectly reasonable standard, because it was, well, Iraq, a chastened Iraq post-1991, and maybe like a North Korea. But, Russians had fallen apart. The Chinese were a long way from where they are today. But obviously, history happened in the last 25 years or 30 years after that. And the global power map changed. And of course, China and Russia, as we're seeing now, went to school on the American military's way of war, have invested a lot more resources. And then we still have, obviously, Iran, North Korea, terrorism, and you could go down the list, Venezuela, Cuba, et cetera. So to put it in simple terms, there's as economists use it, there's a scarcity of power, and particularly military power, versus what we kind of have in the back of our minds as a nation, or sometimes in the front of our minds. We can see that happening, I think, right now, about what we want to be able to do in the world, or what we think we should be doing in the world, and what actually we can. And actually, I think in a military audience or a defense professional audience, this is a lot less of a difficult point to make. One of the things I've really been impressed by, and not in a good way, in promoting the book, is how different the sort of views of the military situation are out in the broader public and in the political elite versus in the professional military, where people are like, we have serious problems, we're really serious problems. And then out in the public, it's kind of, yeah, we hear these things, but nothing's really that bad. So that's the basic problem. So if we don't have enough power to go do all the things that we were doing in, say, 1999 or 2005, well, then we need to rethink. And in that context, we need a strategy. And this is a really important point, I think, in this audience, is, to me, and this is certainly my view in the NDS, is a strategy is not so much a cunning plan. I mean, you can use, I think the origin of the word strategy is like a stratagem, which is a cunning plan, which is some way of outsmarting your enemy, or, the Persians getting the goat, the shepherd to go around the Spartans at Thermopylae or something. But in this context, what a strategy really is more of a framework. It's more of a way of thinking and orienting threats, resources, risk in scarcity, right? So in the same way that a business, okay, what are we really trying to do? What do we really need to worry about? We have limited resources relative to the scope of the problems, and here's how we think about allocating them. And that's what, so what the book really is an attempt to lay out this strategic framework, and it proceeds avowedly from what I would think of as a kind of classically or conventionally realist framework. And my view is this is very consistent with American political tradition because, first of all, I think we should be going out and being realistic for the American people's interests. It's a republic. It's not something else. So we're supposed to serve the American people's interests. And so realism is a good way of doing that. And also the basic idea of realism is don't trust anybody with too much power, which is pretty much the same idea of our government. So I think that's a very defensible and deeply rooted way of proceeding from. And so in that context, you say, okay, so there's more threats out there than we can possibly handle on our own. How do we go about doing it? How do we think about threats and risks? Well, if we think about what we're ultimately in the business of, and we're talking about war and peace here and people dying in large numbers, what are we really trying to do? We're trying to, in my views, defend the American people's security, freedom, and prosperity. And realistically, the only thing that can threaten that, I mean, you could say, sort of a Russian crazy nuclear attack, but in practice, the only thing that can really threaten that is if some entity in the international system agglomerated enough power to be able to impose their will on us through economic coercion, ultimately through military power itself, potentially. And if you look at that, you say, well, what matters actually are states. So non-state actors are not a priority threat. They are a threat, but by definition, they're weaker. So you can use the instruments of national power and investments to try to counteract what they do. And in fact, that's kind of the story of the post 9/11 era, not to be sanguine, but we've made a lot of progress. States are the important actors. And this was actually an important part when we were working early in the 2018 NDS that we thought a lot about this. And if states are the important actors, well, you look at the most important states. What are the ones with the most power? Those are the ones that could do the most damage to you, because at the end of the day, capabilities are what matter. Intentions change. One person can change his or her mind. Leadership can change, et cetera. If that's how that's how you look at the world, well, then China's the biggest power. Well, and where is the most important? Where is that power that could be agglomerated? China's about 20% of global GDP, roughly the same as ourselves. So they couldn't really impose their will on us alone. But if you look at the map of the world, the kind of power map of the world, which tracks to like GDP and productivity, since that's what produces military power and other forms of coercive leverage, East Asia and sort of Southeast Asia are the new decisive theater of the world. 100 years ago is Europe. Now it's Asia, which is roughly going to comprise about 50% or more of global GDP going forward. So Asia is the decisive theater, and China is the most significant actor in the international system. So our primary goal has to be to deny China a hegemonic position over Asia, because if China, 20%, could establish itself over 50%, that would be the most dangerous situation for us. Iran, nasty group leadership, not even, I think, about a third of the GDP of the Middle East. Even Russia, which we're seeing now, very menacing intent, but limited power, even relative to Europe, which itself is a smaller part of the global GDP map. And I'm sure this is something we can discuss in the Q&A, because I don't think none of the fundamentals has changed despite what's happened in Ukraine over the last week, other than to validate that the Russians are, I think it's fair to say, pretty nasty, if not evil in some key respects, and dangerous. But happy to go into that later. But if that's the case, then again, denying China regional hegemony over Asia must be our priority. How do we do that? Well, basically, it's got to be an anti-hegemonic coalition, is what I call it, which is to say we're not strong or resolute enough on our own to stand up to China and Asia for the reasons of geography and resolve and so forth. So instead, we're going to have to work with countries in the region who also want to and have the ability to check China's hegemonic ambitions. And of course, if we look at the map, this is Japan, India, Australia, hopefully South Korea, Taiwan, maybe Vietnam and the Philippines, et cetera. Okay, so far so good. We can actually see this happening now already. I think it started in the coming years, and as usual, it's Xi Jinping did the world a favor by being so aggressive, created balancing behavior, and now this is building through things like the Quad. But the Quad, anti-hegemonic coalition, is more of a concept. The Quad is a piece of it. AUKUS is a piece of it. Our alliance relationships, increasing ties between Japan and Australia, et cetera. So that's all good. But if you're China, you don't necessarily just take that line down. You don't just say, oh, well, they've got an anti-hegemonic coalition, I guess we'll just go along with it. No, if they're resolute about attaining their geoeconomic goals of hegemonic dominance over Asia, then they'll adapt, right? They'll respond effectively if they can. And so in that context, what I think is their best strategy, and I focus on their best strategy, and this is something also I think is worth talking about with this audience. Their best strategy is what you might call a focused and sequential strategy, which is to say, instead of precipitating World War III like Adolf Hitler style and getting everybody to go up against you at the same time and probably lose, and at a minimum lose a lot, cost and so forth. You essentially what the Chinese, I think, are incentivized to try to do, and I think their behavior kind of maps onto this, is try to short circuit or collapse this coalition without paying the full price of a total war. Instead of taking on the US, Japan, India, Australia, Taiwan, et cetera, all at the same time, try to use your coercive leverage more selectively and then cause the coalition to collapse. Now, how would you do that? Well, basically, you can kind of try to do that by isolating members of this anti-hegemonic coalition, zapping them, with your laser, and then showing that this anti-hegemonic coalition is not sufficient to protect countries that are vulnerable to China, right? And this is the problem, is that yes, countries want to stand up and be independent, but they also don't want to be zapped and left alone to China's good graces if they're in this situation. So this is a very real problem. It's what the academics call the balancing versus bandwagoning problem. It's human nature, right? I mean, if you know you're going to lose, you're going to cut a deal more likely. So in this context, the US plays a very important role. And I think of the United States' role in Asia as the external cornerstone balancer. So I'm not a fetishist about US leadership, but I think we need to play a leadership role when it's rational for our strategy, which is connected back to America's interest, to do so. And the problem with Asia is that the countries of Asia are themselves not strong enough to stand up to Asia realistically in a coalition without the United States, because none of them is powerful enough. I mean, anybody who deals with any of these countries it's clear, right? They absolutely need American leadership. And also just in terms of the scale that China can bring. I mean, only, the two Jupiters of the solar system, right? China and the United States. So this is the critical way that we play this important kind of external cornerstone balancer role, to be the kind of pillar of that coalition, the steel in the backbone, or more than that, the steel in the backbone, something else I got to. But China also has a response to this, right? Which is, okay, if the United States plays this critical role, then the key thing to do, paradoxically, is for China actually to go after those vulnerable parts of that coalition that are connected to the United States directly, that basically implicate American credibility. And again, I'm not a credibility fetishist. I focus on what I call sort of differentiated credibility. You might think of it as contextual credibility. This is basically the idea that what really matters when, say, Japan or South Korea or the Philippines are thinking about, do I want to stick around for this anti-hegemonic coalition and take risks to go along with it, is they are going to look at their confidence in America's ability and will to stand up to China in their particular case. And of course, they're going to make judgments based on what they can have, which is imperfect information. So there's an academic argument that credibility doesn't matter, but I mean, anybody who gets a mortgage knows you have to get a credit report, right? I mean, that's just a basic thing. When you're making sort of risky decisions based on future behavior of someone else, you're just going to look for what you can get. And that's what I mean by differentiated credibility. And that is important. But that's different than often you get. The other view is that our credibility is totally interconnected. I don't think that's true. And that's why I don't think the Afghanistan situation is as damaging to our interests in Asia as some do, but happy to get into that. But if that's the case, okay, so the US needs to stand by even vulnerable members of its coalition that are exposed to China. And this leads me to focus on the first island chain, and in particular, Taiwan. Now, I'm not theological about Taiwan, but Taiwan is connected to the United States by this differentiated credibility. And it's also militarily significant. There's semiconductors, there are other reasons. But this is where China has the best incentive to try to use its coercive leverage. These exposed areas like Taiwan, Philippines, potentially Vietnam, which is not connected to us, rather than going immediately to, say, the heart of Japan, which would be a much harder and precipitate a larger conflict. So, okay, so far so good. So then this is where it gets into the military issue. And my basic point, and I would stress this point to you all here, is my bottom line is that the military part is absolutely central. If we do not get the military part right, nothing else will matter. And my experience in the Pentagon is that actually senior military actually underestimate the salience of the M in the dime and overestimate their relative, the importance that they spend time on DI and E. So I actually think it's really important to this audience. We got to get the M right. And that explains the warfighting focus of the 2018 NDS. And the reason is this. China has an incentive to try to achieve its hegemonic goals peacefully at the lowest possible cost and risk. Okay, well, what do? You use coercive leverage. I guess you could try to undermine the Taiwanese government. It hasn't worked. Or you could try economic sanctions. Not working. And it's not working for us. There's an article in the Wall Street Journal today about how limited economic sanctions are in their efficacy. China's actually trying economic sanctions, in a sense, for this purpose, against Australia. It's used economic sanctions against Taiwan, against Japan, against India. Frankly, most of the time, the result has been counterproductive for China. And this is not surprising. We've had this experience too in places like Cuba, North Vietnam, North Korea, even Iraq, the 2003 decision. That was basically the product of the sense in the Bush administration that sanctions were insufficient to achieve the goals. So that's good news. It means that countries can stand up, like Australia, can stand up to China's sort of bludgeoning with economic sanctions, even in the case of Australia, which is very dependent on exports to China. But the bad news is that China then doesn't have to sit still either. And it's going to say, okay, well, what else do I have available? And lo and behold, China has, and it's not a coincidence, China has an incredibly formidable and growing military. And not just an A2AD military, but increasingly very much a power projection military. And so China's going to say rationally, I mean, I think they developed it obviously for this purpose, not a mistake, but what can I use my military instrument to achieve my goals? And let's bear in mind, the purpose is not to achieve purely military aims. Actually, the political goals are likely to remain geoeconomic in nature, and I can get into that if you want. But I mean, it's worth reminding the stated goals of Germany in World War I were a customs union. The stated goals of Japan in World War II were the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. So just because you're using a military instrument doesn't mean that your goals are maximalist or Hitler-like or something like that. And I think we may even be seeing an example of that in Ukraine, although TBD. But here, this is where I think it gets really important for this audience, and where what I really want to do is I hope to frame the importance and the focus of what I hope the defense establishment is working on, and in a sense to catalyze more effort in the direction of solving the very difficult problems that emerge from this fundamentally because of China's power, geography, et cetera. And here the issue is, if China can apply a strategy to use military force to achieve this focused and sequential strategy, it's more likely to do so. And then our interests will be gravely undermined. So how might China go do about this? And I start in a sense with, and this is very much born out of my Pentagon experience, an explanation of why it's important to focus on the best strategy. And if people are interested, I think it's chapter 7. But basically, we should be focusing on Red's best strategy. It may not be their strategy right now. I don't know. I don't have access to that kind of information. It may or may not be the likeliest strategy on any given day. And it's not necessarily the most destructive strategy. It's basically the most net gainful. So in a sense, the most damaging over the long term. And this is for a couple of reasons. Likelihood, I try to rebut the other kinds of orientations that I heard basically in the Pentagon. One is that we should be prepared for everything. And that, of course, is a recipe for failure. Frederick the Great said, he who prepares for everything prepares for nothing. If the example I use is if France, probably a better example would be Britain. If Britain had spent as much time on its colonial wars in the 1930s and not prepared Hawker Hurricanes and Spitfires, wouldn't have mattered, right? They would have won the conflict in Mesopotamia, but they would be toast in the Central Theater in their homeland. And I mean, actually, the example I used when we were doing the NDS was, we risked preparing for the Boer War, and World War I is looming over us. So you got to focus on the most dangerous situation, right? And that's, I think, sort of hopefully that comes through. The second is, and this is more common, although the Russian invasion into Ukraine might change thinking on this, and this one I ran into all the time and really frustrates me, is this likelihood one. And sort of, and this leads us to focus on gray zone and lose the ball on the critical issue. And that's, I think based on two primary fallacies. One is that likelihood does not equate to consequence. So, I mean, the Defense Department's basically kind of, you could think of it more as like a large scale insurance policy. You don't buy insurance, in case it rains when you're going outside, but it doesn't flood that often. But if you're not prepared for a flood and you live in a flooded area, that's a dramatic consequence. So it's lower probability, but higher impact. The second is that likelihood is a dynamic property. So the more you focus on gray zone and not on the high end fight, if the other guy's focusing on the high end fight, that's going to make the high end fight more likely, because then it's going to become more a rational act for that side. And so, we really should focus on the best strategy. The final one is destructive. This is kind of critiquing those who are saying we need to build a perfect national missile defense or something. I mean, our opponents are going to probably be like Darwinian rational, and we have a nuclear deterrent. If we spend everything on protecting against the most destructive potential outcome, we're going to leave ourselves vulnerable to their best strategy. And this is, I think is something actually that the Department of Defense already does anyway. But I think this is important because it frames the way that we think about defense strategy and how to orient our focus. And I think one thing to say about here is I'm very focused on scenarios and the potential for war and making sure we can fight a war credibly. And that is possible. And we're seeing that right now, that it's very possible that a great power will elect to use its military. But there's a concept in the book that I use, and I think it's very important for a defense audience, is the concept of imagined wars. That is sort of like the dark matter that shapes international politics and outcomes. So if you look back at the history of the Cold War and you just look at the series of events that occurred in Europe, it's actually kind of seems like not that much happened, right? I mean, there was the Berlin crises in the late 50s, early 60s. There was obviously the Berlin airlift. There was more going on at the beginning, but then it looks like things were kind of peaceful. But that's not how it was actually happening. What was actually happening was perpetual, continual adaptation, and people thinking that a war could happen, and that if it didn't happen, if you weren't prepared, the other side was going to have a lot of coercive leverage, because the coercive leverage would be either I'm going to come in here and kick your tail and you're going to have to do what I want, or you and I both know that would happen, and there's going to be consequent political leverage ensuing from that. And I just put this out on Twitter a couple of days ago to the Germans, actually. There's a great document really laying this out from the West German government in their famous West German 1983 defense white paper. So this is the important thing, is this, even if a high-end war doesn't happen, it can still shape behavior because of the expectations of how that war would resolve. So it's really critical that we, and the defense establishment, have the ability and sort of the credible ability to meet this threat, this best strategy, and do so also, I stress, in a way that's consistent with Americans' costs and risks tolerance, right? Because a defense strategy that imposes too much cost and risk based on the scenario or the sort of the battle, if you will, the American people, well, first of all, I don't think it's right. I think for $770 billion or whatever, we should get a better strategy. But also, it's much more likely that the American people will balk at actually implementing it, because they'll say, well, that doesn't make a lot of sense. So why would I do that? That doesn't make sense. And we don't want to get in that situation. So the job of the defense establishment is to really come up with a strategy to meet Red's best strategy in a way that's consistent with Americans' costs and risk tolerance. And this is like, okay, so this gets to the point where the rubber meets the road for the defense establishment, because, okay, what is Red's best strategy? Well, we talked about the focus and sequential. And I think at this point, my argument is that we have to very much plan for the potential that they use military force. And, basically they're going to try to pick off members of this anti-hegemonic coalition and try to collapse it. Okay. Well, if you look at that, Taiwan is basically, we can talk more about this, but Taiwan is basically the most vulnerable for a variety of reasons, the most propitious target. I do think the Philippines is a possibility, and it will become more of a possibility. And again, I stress, China's goals need not be annexation of the Philippines to be willing to use military force against the Philippines and South Korea as well, but rather, again, to break apart this anti-hegemonic coalition without the full-scale war. So if we're saying that, so what's Red's best strategy? Well, I believe it's basically a limited war. And when I say limited war, I don't mean like Kosovo, 1999, or even Vietnam. I mean something below the level of a large-scale strategic exchange. It might even include significant limited nuclear use, but really it's a situation in which two nuclear armed superpowers that have survivable arsenals go at it in a way that's below the level of sort of apocalyptic spasmodic destruction. And I try to lay out the logic and idea of limited war in chapter 6. And this is, one of the kind of sections I'm sort of proudest of, because I've been thinking about this for years and years. And I think it was something Americans grappled with a lot in the latter part of, well, actually starting in the 50s, but throughout the Cold War. But it has really fallen out of favor because we've been so dominant vis-a-vis our potential adversaries over the last generation. So I'm trying to re-inject this thinking. Now, I'm not saying, I think this audience, I don't need to say this, but I'm not saying that it's a good idea to try to get in a limited war with a nuclear armed superpower. But obviously, if you're thinking about this imagined wars thing, we can't just let them run the tables whenever they say, I have a nuclear weapon. I mean, apropos is what Putin and Lavrov are saying right now, which is, right? So we have to have some reaction to these kinds of, this possibility. And so in that context, and I think the Chinese pretty clearly are preparing for this. They say they're preparing for limited wars under informationalized conditions. Others can correct me on that. But okay, if that's the case, then I think their best bet is to go after an exposed member of this anti-hegemonic coalition, try to wrap it up, create a new reality, because they want to sort of set a new reality that's much more difficult for us to defend, and then basically either reset, or they might continue. But basically, we can think about it as like, reset the situation and say, are you feeling lucky, America? Because to come and recapture Taiwan, or let alone the Philippines, is going to be a much more difficult proposition. I think this, generally speaking, it's easier to defend. A prepared defense is generally easier than offense against a prepared defense. So that's the kind of the best option. And here I think it's really important. I am persuaded. The blockade is a serious, very serious scenario that needs to be prepared for. But really, the direct invasion is by far the most effective form. Like if I were in Beijing, I would be recommending a direct invasion at some point, or at least the credible threat thereof, to achieve the political goals. Because look, a wiser man than I, Napoleon and Jim Mattis also said, if you want to take Vienna, take Vienna. I think Mattis added a nice profanity to it to give it a Marine flavor. But basically the idea is, look, the most effective form of coercion is just getting in there and forcing them to do it. And actually, again, I hate to keep bringing it back to it, but we're kind of seeing it in Ukraine very tragically right now. And Iraq is another example. We weren't trying to annex the country. All we want to do is for Saddam to give up WMD or verifiably do that. Well, the only way to get to do that was to invade the country and decapitate the government. The Mexican War. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870. Yes, they ended up taking Alsace-Lorraine, but really it was more about allowing the unification of Germany. So the best form of coercive leverage in general, but certainly with military force, is a direct invasion. That's the bad news, makes that more attractive. The good news means that if we can deny that strategy, then we are in a pretty good place. So that is where the strategy of denial kicks in. And that's why I'm an obsessive on denial, along with some other people like Mike Gallagher, is if we can do denial, we can defeat their best strategy. They're not in a good way. And this is important because I hear arguments for horizontal escalation or vertical escalation. And this is what worries me now about integrated deterrence, is it sounds very subtle and nuanced, but keep it simple, stupid, right? Like at the end of the day, what's the most effective form of defeating red strategy is denying it. Now, that denying it does not mean dominating the airspace of China. It's actually a relatively low political standard, or even really in a sense that military outcomes. It's just the scale of China is so great that it's quite demanding. And so what I'm saying here is what I really think we should do is denial to the extent needed to keep that vulnerable ally in the anti-hegemonic coalition. So getting back to what a defense strategy is different from a military strategy because it connects directly up to that political level. The political goal is sustaining the anti-hegemonic coalition in the face of China's pressure. The military goal should serve that. Very Clausewitzian mentality I try to adhere to, which is, okay, political goal, military objective, military constraints is in that purpose. So if we can deny their best strategy to subordinate an ally within the anti-hegemonic coalition will succeed, and they will lose. And that's it. That's what I want to be able to do. And I don't, I'll get to this later, but I don't know why we would take any risk on that, because the Chinese can rinse and repeat. So denial is great. I can talk more about the specifics of denial. I go into it a lot in the book. What I'll say about that is that, you know, we have a lot of built-in advantages in Taiwan, but we have a lot of built-in dangers because of the scale of how powerful China is and some of the political optics. But it's an island, it's 100 miles. The people don't want to be part of the PRC. This is something that's doable. The problem is, what happens if denial fails or we can't pull it off? And that could happen for two reasons. One is we just can't pull it off because the Chinese are so darn strong. The second is, what if China is strong enough that what they would force us to do, or sort of their capability, and in order to deny them the ability to take Taiwan, we would have to expand the war. And this gets into the limited war problem. And I think this is probably, my guess is this is maybe, and again, I'm looking at it from the outside these days, but this may be where the discussion is now. Because my impression is that A, the Chinese are super powerful and growing more so, and B, they seem to be thinking that the war would not remain so super localized. So I don't think people seem to be thinking, oh, this is not going to exceed 25 miles off the coast of Taiwan. So what do we do in this situation? What do we do if we can't wage a very effective, very localized war that doesn't involve, I mean, I think under any circumstances, we're going to have to prepare to hit the Chinese mainland. That's just the price of entry, or at least in some areas. But what if we have to go deep? What if we have to degrade a lot more? And this is where I come up with what I call the binding strategy, which I think is hopefully something that catches people's attention, because I think it's hopefully one of the more forward-leaning elements of my argument. And this is basically the idea that critical in my argument is the interplay between power and resolve, and the fact that resolve is a dynamic property itself. So people sometimes talk about, well, the Chinese care more about Taiwan than we do. Well, that's almost certainly true. But the point is that how a war starts and evolves, and we may be seeing this as well, itself affects our level of resolve. And so the key point that I would want to make here is how we plan our military and how our military fights and is postured will have a big impact on our resolve and the resolve of our allies and potential third parties that might be more or less supportive. And we should be consciously, manipulating sounds negative, but manipulating, really, setting the table for us to succeed in this way and putting dilemmas onto China, where if it wants to wage a localized war just to achieve local aims, it's going to have to do things that are going to catalyze our resolve. So my two favorite examples of this are, one, the Japanese in December of 1941. I mean, some of them were probably thinking, why are we attacking the Americans? Like, we can just pick off the carcass of the European colonial empires, and Americans aren't going to want to come in and defend European colonial empires. But instead, they invaded Pearl Harbor and they killed a bunch of people, and brutal, and they attacked the Philippines. And then we got really angry, righteous might, right? FDR. And then not only did we come into the war, but we waged the war with a ferocity such that we completely defeated Japan. And that was not a given. I mean, if the Japanese had started the war differently and conducted it differently, we might have settled for a negotiated peace well before August 1945. The other example I like to use is the opening of the Civil War, which is, there were a bunch of these vulnerable federal troops on Fort Sumter. And I think my understanding is the Army wanted to withdraw them because they were so vulnerable. But Lincoln said, I want them to fire the first shot. Don't move those guys. And eventually the Confederates blinked and they fired. And that led immediately to 75,000, I think, volunteers for the federal army, which had a decisive impact on the overall course of the war. So that's the kind of model of what, and be deliberate, obviously, for the purpose of deterrence. Ultimately, we don't want a war, but we want the Chinese to see that we're ready and capable. And that's the binding strategy. And this is where I think probably is quite important in the defense establishment right now, given the debates within the China context about a purely offshore force. And I'm all in favor. I mean, I'd be in favor of, if you want to put conventional IRBMs or in Alaska or something, I'd be all for that. But I do think we need a forward, resilient, I mean, they're both blunt layer in the terminology of the NDS of 2018, because it's about effect, not the location of the forces. But I think it's very valuable to have forces forward in a combat credible way, resilient, lethal way, that force the Red, and that's not the only way, by the way, but it's kind of the most obvious, that force Red to have to deal with this situation. Like, am I going to attack? I've heard that there might be American forces in Indonesia. I just don't know, and my ISR is being jammed. I'm going to take care of them. Now, that's the thing the Japanese decided, or the Germans decided in 1914 by going through Belgium. Made sense operationally, big mistake politically, and ultimately that had military implications because of the entry of Great Britain and so forth. So this is sort of the binding strategy. And the critical idea here is the burden of escalation, because a war between these two nuclear armed superpowers, if it ends, God willing, is going to end with a negotiated cessation of hostilities of some kind, or a petering out in a protracted conflict. And that's going to be voluntary, ultimately, unless both sides, end up killing each other. And that's, I think, the way, now this is, again, comes out of my kind of nuclear background, I think the way these things would be likely to end, and as Herman Kahn said, who else has experience of nuclear warfare? I don't know, is the side that bears this burden of escalation, and it's familiar from any kind of negotiation, which is, if I have to do something that seems dramatic and radical and aggressive and provocative, that's a burden. And that's going to make me less likely to ask for more. And so to bring it, to concretize it in a bit, that is why denial is so important, is because I think a war like this is likely to resolve itself with the results of the conventional or sort of local fight being where they are. That in a sense, just putting things down is likely to be where things end up, because the burden of escalation, including nuclear weapons, I mean, look, we've been ignoring these Russian nuclear threats as far as I can tell. It's not really affecting, I mean, beyond the sense that we are already aware of them. But it's hard to get nuclear weapons. The Russians aren't going to say, even if they did something and say, we're going to nuke the West if you don't force the Ukrainians to give up. I don't think that would work. And we can go into the reasons why. And it would undermine the Russian credibility as well. But I think this is why having a local conventional defense, and again, local, the effects are local, not necessarily the forces, is where it's going to be critical. And where defeating the fait accompli is so critical, because if the fait accompli succeeds, the burden's going to be on us. And this is also why strategies of horizontal that rely on horizontal and vertical escalation. Obviously, horizontal and vertical escalation can be part of our quiver, but they shouldn't be our primary emphasis. They don't really work out, because the burden of escalation, they put too much on us. If our idea for, they take over Taiwan and we're going to tank our economy to blockade China, I mean, the American people are going to say what, and the Chinese aren't going to give up. And of course, vertical escalation to large scale first use, not going to. Well, certainly, it's not a good idea, and I don't think it's going to be very credible. So that's bottom line. If we can get a denial defense of Taiwan, and that doesn't mean that Taiwan's sitting pretty. It could be like the Blitz, or it could be like V1 and V2 attacks on Great Britain in World War II. But it's enough to keep them going on. Okay. Where does that leave me? And then I'm going to open it up. I've gone on too long already. Where does that leave me? Chapter 11 is basically the outlines of if I were doing a new NDS, and of course, in national defense strategies, or any strategy, is a point in time. So shouldn't be set in stone. Although I think the logic is the same. But carrying forward the same logic is the joint force. The most important thing in the world is China and Asia, and the joint in order to sustain the anti-hegemonic coalition, the joint force should be able to, along with our allies, particularly Taiwan, Japan, Australia, should be able to deny a fait accompli attack against Taiwan. If we're not there, that should be the priority. Nothing else should come before that, except two other missions. One is nuclear deterrence, so our country should not be subject to nuclear threats, including from both sides. So at this point, I guess we're going to have to increase our nuclear forces, or bring stuff out of the hedge and that kind of thing. And then a low-cost counterterrorism, because the nut jobs out there who are non-state actors, but who are willing to go the extra mile to do terrible things, we should keep our eye on them, but it's got to be low cost. Those are the three core missions of the armed forces, as far as I can see. Everything else has got to be a backseat. The one other mission that I think really makes sense to be able to have, but only after we've resourced the ability to defend Taiwan, is to help NATO in defending against Russia. Because obviously Europe's very important, and Russia's a significant threat. The reason that we can take that kind of risk in Europe, although this to me is, I kind of leave this open to whether the American people want to spend that level of extra money, is what's happening right now. which is that Europe and European NATO is a much larger GDP than Russia. I mean, so Russia is a threat, particularly its nuclear forces and its reinvigorated conventional forces, but it's dwarfed by European GDP and latent military power. And until recently, it was like the Europeans just didn't have the will. Well, Vladimir Putin changed that very quickly. So the polls apparently today, they just went to 3%, which is like, wow. And the Germans, I mean, mirabile dictu, have gone to 2%. So there's a strategic issue about how do we time this, and we have a sort of a graceful view. And I think we should absolutely remain committed to NATO. We should be prepared to defend NATO, but in a way that always husbands the forces necessary for a Taiwan contingency first, that we should withhold those forces, even if the Russians go first. Ideally, we would reshape the military to do these 3 big missions and then also have capacity for a Russian. But that would involve a dramatic reshaping of our military. And I think this is the debate, for those of you who are following it, that I'm participating in right now, where I feel like I'm debating kind of into the air, because some people in this audience, I don't think it's going to be as remarkable, but like I'm trying to reckon with the reality of military scarcity, and my opponents in this debate are saying that military resources aren't zero sum. I had one of them, I won't name who, but like I was like, well, you're going to like reassemble the missile that you blew up somewhere, or like that bomber that got shot down. What are you going to? It takes years, as you all well know, to build that. And the problem is that we're not where we need to be on the Asia posture. I mean, or the Asia scenarios. And this is public from Clint Highnote and Dave Ochmanek and others. So, I mean, I'm not telling you anything none of you know. So this is the urgency. Some of my Republican friends are saying, we should increase defense spending. I don't think that's a panacea. I also personally think it's a little lame. And I was talking to a friend of mine, for like defense specialists to be like, give me more money first. If we get to that point, I mean, I think we're almost certainly going to have to increase defense spending, even just to maintain, sort of keep at the current pace, which is insufficient. But I think we should be making choices within the defense program, prioritizing, being ruthlessly efficient, like basically stop doing everything other than those 4 things: exercises, presence operations, force structure. That would be great. That would be better. Now, is that going to happen? Probably not. In which case, we're probably going to have to spend more on defense. But I think it's incumbent on the defense establishment to try. And that's what we were really trying with the National Defense Strategy, was like, first, get us to at least a yellow light on the Taiwan and the Asia picture before you worry about simultaneity with the Middle East or anything else or something like that. So with that, I went on longer than I had hoped, but you did ask me to talk for 45 minutes, Mike. So I guess I can't be faulted too much.
You're not faulted at all, Rich. And that was not at all too long. That was just right. Rich, I'd like to begin the questions myself with, you've spoken mostly about the content. What about process? There's an old saying that an elephant is a mouse created by a committee. I haven't been involved in a national strategy for quite a long time, but back when I was involved in a few national strategies, it was such a bureaucratic process that it ended up being the product of a lowest common denominator rather than a true strategy. And the strategies ended up looking like Christmas trees with everybody hanging their ornament on it. If you were in charge, how would you go about creating the kind of strategy that you've described within a bureaucratic structure?
Yeah. I agree with you. I liken the old QDRs to like World War I attrition warfare. It's like the Somme. It's like you send in all these people and you get nowhere. And in the NDS of 2018, it was more like maneuver, and that wasn't anything that any some stroke of genius on my part. It was structure. So frankly, the political situation at the time was such that there was an opening for a variety of reasons I can get into. And also there was a hyper-empowered Secretary of Defense who a lot of people were saying, you're the man, I mean, without getting into all the politics, like, we trust you. Frankly, the typical policy elite of the Republican Party was not involved. And so that created, frankly, a kind of a vacuum. And then the single most important decision, I'm a realist, I'm a structuralist, I think the single most important decision that made the NDS of 2018 possible was Secretary Mattis said, I'm going to create a small team and they're going to report directly to me, and then eventually to the deputy Shanahan later. And that's how I'm going to do it. And that, more than anything else, rather than a bottom-up process that had to go through layers of review and lowest common denominator, and maybe I don't know. I guess I'm like a, well, I don't want to speak to my own role, but that enabled a kind of approach. Not only enabled the approach, but enabled its efficacy. So the way the NDS of 2018 actually ended up working was, it was a very sharp document at the, like, very, very sharp document at the beginning. Then, and that was up with the secretary and the deputy secretary, and then it started to get socialized, and then it got hit. But speaking of fait accompli, by the time the bureaucratic counterattack came, it was already sort of too far, and it had started to bring in supporters and allies, and based on bureaucratic interest or personality. Because the thing, Kissinger has this great line. He says, strategic changes cannot be brought about by virtuoso performance. They have to reflect underlying realities. And of course, the NDS of 2018 was saying, not saying like, let's focus on a Martian invasion, saying like, let's look at what's happening, and building on the third offset. I mean, Bob Work, in sense, he's John the Baptist. I think I joke with him. He's John the Baptist. He's out there crying, and he's the first one. And so, but by the time that bureaucratic counterattack came from those with other views or interests, it had already gotten strength, and then that actually led to some supporters to come in. So but the point is, if it had been done the normal way with a 2-star running a QDR team for the Marines, the Air Force, I don't think it would have. And we'll see what the current situation produces. My view is that just keeping up with where the NDS of 2018 was is going to be insufficient. That's why I wrote, kind of what I'm arguing in the book. We have to be moving forward, even as the situation is deteriorated. Because again, a strategy is trying to get ahead of the problem. That's the point. Shouldn't just reflect. And the other thing the NDS of 2018 did, which was, again, but this is where, Secretary Mattis's role is so important. And actually, well, Bob's Works role as the early deputy secretary, but then Shanahan, deputy secretary, the focus on prioritization. I think one of the most important things in the actual 2018 NDS is telling the department what to do less of, because that is a credible signal of prioritization. And that's not easy for politically accountable leaders to do. And so that also, whenever someone says, whenever someone says we can walk and chew gum at the same time, or we can prioritize this while also doing all these other things, one of the good things about my role in the Pentagon was I had this strategy role, but I was also the policy representative in the program and budget review process. So I would see, the Pentagon in some sense is really a purchasing organization, right? So it's like and that's where the rubber meets the road. That's where the strategy really happens. And if you just say, hey, that's a priority, but that's also a priority, you're not giving any guidance. So you're going to essentially perpetuate inertia. And that's what we were, for a variety of these kind of sort of idiosyncratic or particular reasons we're able to, I think, take advantage of.
Thank you, Rich. I agree that sometimes I feel like our greatest enemy is inertia and complacency and the unwillingness to move forward. Question from Rabauer. From a grand strategy perspective, how would you suggest enablement of a true grand strategy that can endure for years and across different administrations?
And excuse me for eating. I apologize. It's a little, I hope it's not unpleasant for others. Well, I'm a realist, so the thing that's most likely to create that kind of bipartisan consensus over time is the behavior of our enemies, for lack of a better term. And I think we kind of see that happening. Probably the one thing Republicans and Democrats most agree on is that China's a challenge. How to deal with it is a different story. But in fact, I was having breakfast with a member of Congress this morning, and this individual was saying, political guy, but he was saying, we need to have a bipartisan consensus. So I think it's possible, and it's also worth remembering we kind of romanticized the Cold War, but there were intensely political debates about grand strategy during the Cold War, and I actually, in a way, to be honest, I actually think politicization of the grand strategy discussion is not necessarily a totally bad thing, because it suggests that politicians think that the issue is important and that getting a better position is politically advantageous, which means they think it's significant. If something is really just a kind of bipartisan technocratic issue, it's probably not that important, I think, because if people think something's important, they're gonna look at it. That's how they're gonna vote. So I mean, I don't want to take that too far, but I don't think we should take it totally. I don't think we should overstate that part. But I think I mean, I will say honestly, I'm expecting a fair amount of continuity from the defense strategy, from the National Defense Strategy of 2022. From what I mean, I'm not involved at all, but from what I can hear on the tea leaves, it sounds like a lot of continuity. And you looked at that Indo-Pacific strategy document that the White House just released. There's a lot of continuity. There's progressive things in there because it's a Democratic administration, but despite like some pretty rancorous politics, that's actually, I would say we're actually moving in that direction. And I mean, I've co-authored pieces with some of the people on this, Eli Ratner, the Assistant Secretary for Asia. I mean, he and I wrote a piece on the South China Sea 8 years ago. So it's not like you can't find common ground. Or I mentioned Dave Ochmanek or Bob Work. I mean, I think I'm actually a little bit more sanguine than most people are about the impact of the domestic bitterness on our national strategy.
Tom Mensch begins with a quote: "Amateurs talk about strategy and tactics. Professionals talk about logistics and sustainability in warfare." How does this quote, that has come in various forms, square away with your push to make the M more prominent in the dying paradigm for military planners?
Funny thing, I have a slightly amended version of that quote based on being in a war game a couple of years ago with a bunch of retired, senior officers, and they spent like half the time talking about command and control. So I was like, amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics, and experts talk command and control. That's my amendment of the quote. But no, logistics is critical because logistics is how you fight. I mean, we're seeing this with the Russians too. I think what it means is, in fact, one of the key points in the 2018 NDS was contested logistics, right? That in a sense, it's going to be a war. It's going to be limited, but I'm sure that the Russians or Chinese would seek to undermine our logistics chains, non-kinetically, but probably kinetically as well. So I think what we need to think about is, and if you go back to victory in the Pacific in World War II, it's combat logistics fleet. And logistics is just, I think logistics like posture is consistently neglected, I guess, because it doesn't seem as romantic or whatever. But to your point, the question's point, professionals understand how important it is. And I think it was Napoleon, an army marches on its stomach, right? So I'm not sure I have anything more to say about that. I mean, one of the things about what I want to do with the book, and why I've gotten some critiques for this, which I think misunderstand the point of the book and reflect a lack of understanding of the defense planning process. I think anybody who reads this book, who's worked in the Pentagon, will understand that it has dramatic implications for how the Pentagon buys, what it buys, where it puts things, et cetera, right? But I think my value add, such as it is to try to have like this framework and this model and walk the logic down. My value add is not to say we need to buy exactly this many LRASMs and not this many maritime TACTOMs, or this many F-35s. They're much better qualified people. What I'm trying to do is give a framework in which you say, okay, here's my problem. Now I'm going to go try to solve it. So to me, I actually said this, I think there's no more exciting and challenging time to be in the defense establishment now than probably since the 1970s. Because the 70s in a lot of ways were a similar era. When we were getting out of Vietnam, we knew the posture in Western Europe was unsatisfactory. But there were these new technologies that were coming in. And so what's the problem? The problem is, how do we, without nuclear dominance, now that we're at parity with the Soviets, how do we have a credible, effective, sub-strategic nuclear exchange military strategy. And what does that mean? And how do we leverage technology? So you get people like Glenn Kent, who are working with precision strike and night vision and GMTI and these things putting together. Oh, and then suddenly you got, well, I got this concept called, follow-on forces attack, which would not have been possible before precision, right? And before AWACS and JSTARS and all these, and that's an interactive process. But it took creativity. So I'm not the Glenn Kent. I'm the guy, not to exaggerate my role, but I'm trying to help form the thing where it's like the problem can be solved in that place. And this is where, I mean, not to butter him up too much, but General High Note, I think, is a leader, and to understand strategic problem that we've got to get denial, understands the technology is coming, new concepts of warfare. Red is doing this, and that's the problem. And that in a sense, the profession of arms. This is where we really need help, and where the civilian world writ large, only the M can do this. So don't my feeling is, don't let people say that the M is only one. Oh yeah. No. If we don't get the M right, and if you don't do your job to the level of an Olympic athlete, we could have a war and we could lose it. And so that, to me, if I were speaking to military, or if I were General Colby or something, I would say, this is the kind of the motivating speech I would give, because I think it's really, people join the military to be challenged, to lead, to charge forward in a smart way. And so I think that's kind of what and so same thing for logistics. Logistics is like, I don't know exactly what the answer is, but I know what the problems are. And I know this is this is what I think the problem is, and the framing of how to solve it.
About 45 years ago, either I or a friend of mine, it's so long ago I can't remember who wrote it, but there was an article that was written called "You Can't Be There Till You Get There," which pointed out the logistic challenges of the Middle East. And I think it's even more salient in the case of Asia and China. This question comes from Todd Veazey, my brother on the strategic multi-layer assessment team. In the absence of a clearly articulated description of a preferred, durable relationship between the US and China to serve as a North Star to guide American statecraft, it seems that we are left contesting an infinite game in a completely reactive strategic posture. So here comes the question. Your proposed strategy of denial provides a proactive direction centered on their best strategy, but does it create a self-regulating outcome, or does it just push off the inevitable?
It's a great question. And I end the book, chapter 12, is called A Decent Peace. And that is the concrete goal. And I think a friend of mine, said one of the more distinctive things, hopefully, of this book is actually, the military likes to say end state. History is never final, obviously, but it's a preferred and I think realistic end state. My end state is not that China becomes a freedom-loving democracy and that everybody hugs each other. My end state is a stable balance of power in which China is not able to agglomerate enough power to break apart the anti-hegemonic coalition and impose its will on us. But that is consistent with China being an immensely powerful superpower and a nation that commands respect and a unique place in the world, probably just alongside the United States. And so that's the sort of, again, that realist goal. And I am worried about this because I think a lot of the rhetoric in Washington is going way ahead of our power base. And frankly, I think what the American people actually probably want, which is this kind of new Cold War rhetoric. And there are elements of the, of a Cold War element that I think we're heading to, but it's not we shouldn't make it a Procrustean kind of framework that we're trying to push the thing into. But no, I think, and again, this sort of Clausewitzian thing that I aspire to. I mean, you can always tell who somebody wants to be affiliated with by who they put in their quotations. So I quote Clausewitz up front, and it's basically the political object should be shot through of everything that we're doing. And I think I've been clear a few times, hopefully, about what that political object is. But that also gives us a regulator to say, And I wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs, if you're interested, Todd, about a year and a half ago with Bob Kaplan or Robert Kaplan, kind of pushing back on this then fairly nascent argument that has now become more and more vehement, and basically saying this is not an ideological cage match to the end. This is not about American liberal hegemony. This is about a stable balance of power in which we can live with dignity, and we'll probably have a sort of block of our own and so forth. We may something that more than that may happen, and that might be great, but we're not going to fight over it. And I mean, frankly, I was talking to a friend. I mean, we're in a pretty dangerous time right now. Just flux is sort of transition periods probably are particularly dangerous. I mean, if you look at the Cold War, the first, sort of depending on when you started, 10 to 12 years, were a lot more dangerous than the subsequent almost 30, right? I mean, you look at the Berlin airlift, then the Berlin riots, 53, you look at Hungary in 1956, you look at the Berlin crises, and then the Cuban Missile Crisis. And then there's sort of a sense, okay, like here's where things, and then, they obviously cracked down in the Prague Spring and in Poland, but but I think unfortunately now we're in flux time. And I think we've got to be particularly careful, both that we're not too weak, but also that we don't go overboard.
Thank you. From Shale, how do we accelerate development of the tremendous local resistance capacity of Taiwan? What about asymmetric capabilities, including striking critical infrastructure in China, like the Three Gorges Dam?
So I think I'm a huge fan of the asymmetric capabilities. Excuse me. In fact, I'm such a big fan of it that I've told the Taiwanese that I think they should buy it, or we should sanction them with tariffs. So I think we're beyond the point where we should be just nice to Taiwan, because we're not doing it for Taiwan. We're doing it for America. They benefit, but it's Americans who are going to die. So why are we allowing them to buy F-16? I mean, it's just crazy. But I think things are improving. I actually think people might end up taking a little bit of the wrong lesson from Ukraine on this point. And I mean, I'm far from an expert on it, but the fact that, well, first of all, we'll see how this fight goes, but the fact that incredibly courageous Ukrainians are standing up at a kind of civil resistance level to Russia is indicative. But one thing, Ukraine's about, I don't know what, like a quarter the size of Russia in terms of population, maybe GDP. Ukraine's also a huge land area, right? So, and the Russian military, while formidable, is much more limited, and Russia's economic base is much more limited, not only relative to Ukraine, but relative to its other potential threats like us and NATO. China is 1.4 billion people, the world's largest economy, or we are, depending on how you measure it. Taiwan is a country of 23 million people. And it's a small island. And yes, it's 100 miles off the coast of China, but it's also hundreds of miles from our logistics hubs, to go back to the logistics point. So my sense, honestly, and the Chinese have millions of people as armed police and I think if the Chinese are able to kind of consolidate their hold on the island, they will put down an insurgency probably. I mean, there was an insurgency in the Philippines during the Japanese occupation. Didn't make that much of a difference. I mean, the German occupation of France, I think it's a different kettle of fish. I think the best investment of asymmetric and kind of porcupine investments is in making their initial assault and attempt to consolidate their hold at the beginning as difficult as possible. So that, which actually shifts more towards an emphasis on the professional military and resilience to blockade. So I don't have a super strong, but I mean, I'd rather see the Taiwan bristling with anti-ship cruise missiles and air defense and javelins in case the Chinese land in force, and rather than sort of hey, we're going to go in the mountains and or throw Molotov cocktails in Taipei. I think if we're at the point where Ukraine is now in Taiwan, it would be very bad. I'd rather keep it. And the thing is, it's a land border, right? So the Russians can roll right over, whereas the Chinese, the price of entry to Taiwan is a lot higher because 100 miles of water.
Christo Hopkins asks, if denial is preemptively focused on eliminating opportunities of threats with respect to counter U.S. influence or power, is it possible or a concern that states like Russia or China could perceive U.S. actions closer to the containment strategies of the Cold War?
Well, I don't think what I'm talking about is containment, honestly. I mean, Ashley Tellis, who's a brilliant scholar at the Carnegie Endowment, for those of you who haven't come across him, I mean, he wrote a piece about 10 years ago that really influenced my thinking. It's called Balancing Without Containment. And I think containment was like, we're going to keep these guys in a box until they fall apart. What I'm talking about is a balance of power. So it doesn't mean that China can't expand its influence. It's just we're going to have to correlatively compensate. So, you know, if they add Pakistan, we're going to add, I mean, that's kind of already there. But if UAE becomes a Chinese ally, well, then maybe whoever's got a problem with UAE will, you know, Saudi or something will be on our side, or vice versa. And that's important also because, you know, China's not a truly Marxist economy, right? So I don't think we have a lot of reason to think that it will completely collapse. I mean, you could have a change of government structure or a different kind of government. Although over time, I wouldn't expect China's behavior or incentives to change dramatically or fundamentally. I mean, and actually probably the best example of this is Russia. I mean, the Soviet Union collapsed. We had a nice relationship for 10 years, and now we've had a more adversarial one since, I don't know, 2007, 2008, more or less. And it's not a Marxist government. I don't think Putin is not a Marxist. He thinks the Soviet Union did a lot of bad things. He's a great Russian nationalist. So I don't think, you know, I'm trying to think, okay, you know, how do we make this, how do we protect our interests? Because I mean, look, I mean, it's like, it sounds like special pleading, but I really don't want to war with China, you know. I mean, but I think the way we're going to avoid a war with China is strength balanced with restraint. But the problem is we're way behind on the strength part. So once we get to strength, then we can have détente. Détente has a bad name because of the 70s, but actually, like, okay, we go from a more confrontational posture to one that's more balanced because we're in a position where we already have the, you know, in 1978, you had, they weren't going to do that well, I guess, but like you had Allied forces on the inter-German border. You know, there was already a military posture there. Or Reagan, 85, 86, you could have a different posture because we had such a strong deterrent in Europe. That's not where we are.
An anonymous questioner notes that the Chinese military is not nearly as formidable as its budget would suggest. It goes on to say, Chinese demographics are going in the wrong direction toward an inverted pyramid of old versus young. The Chinese Communist Party is going to have existential difficulties supporting an aging populace and a military. What are your thoughts on that?
I'll confess, I'm pretty skeptical of those arguments. At the end of the day, I don't know what the future of China is, but a couple of things. I mean, it's true the Chinese military hasn't been tested and maybe less than it's advertised, but the American military has not been in high-end conflict in a long time. I mean, they practice. When was the last time American naval forces were in like a serious, you know, sea control kind of fight? It's been a long time. I think American ground forces haven't been under direct air attack since the Korean War, as I understand it. And I mean, have been focused, people very nobly, not for me to say, but service in Afghanistan and Iraq, but that was not pure conflict. So obviously one of the things we were trying to do in the NDS and that Third Offset was trying to do was to try to get people refocused on that. So there's been training, people going to NTC and Nellis and so forth more often, but we don't really know. And so, and then the other thing is, like, you know, as Stalin said, quantity has a quality all its own. I mean, one of the things about the assessment of the Taiwan scenario is, well, can the Chinese do it? Well, they can do it if they're willing to lose X thousand people versus they're only willing to lose 1/10 of that. You know, if Xi Jinping is prepared to lose 20,000 people, it may be doable and it's going to be ugly. But I mean, similar to what the Russians are going through right now, except China's got a much bigger economic base to regenerate. So that's kind of the military thing. I personally am very skeptical and cautious about giving us too much of an advantage. I don't think anybody knows how that would go. And I'm just very, like, to me, it's almost like, okay, hey, you won the Super Bowl the last few years. You're in, you know, summer training or whatever it is for football. And hey, the Patriots this year are not that, they're not going to be that good. So don't worry about it. That's not the attitude I think we should take. I think the military should be like, these guys are really, really good. They're focused. They're not unbeatable, but we got to be at the top of our game. The second point is the collapse of the Chinese economy. I mean, it's possible, and the demographic thing. Yeah, demographics are happening throughout the OECD world, including among our allies like Japan, South Korea, Taiwan. In fact, I think Taiwan has a lower population rate than China. And also, people who are putting money to work, and I deal with kind of investors and stuff like in some of my goings on. They seem to think China's got significant growth prospects left, right? I mean, so that's kind of like, you really got to put your money where your mouth is. So that leads me to, I think it's often a think tank kind of thing that China's about to collapse. And I just don't think we should base our strategy on a hope. And if I'm thinking about it in a kind of risk reward scenario, well, I'm better off preparing for the downside, which is continued Chinese growth from a military perspective, rather than if I'm unprepared, if that happens, that's going to be very bad. Worst case scenario, if it falls apart, is I'm over prepared and I've overspent on the military, which is, I'd rather have that than the other one.
In his book, The Kill Chain, Chris Brose argues that the future of warfare will be strongly determined by technological weaponization. What are the ramifications, the implications of that argument for your strategy argument?
Well, I think Chris's brilliant and really important book is actually, I think he said this, our books are very complementary, because my book is a defense strategy book. It's kind of the NDS sort of level of thinking or whatever. And Chris's book is how Chris might not, actually, Chris is one of the most interesting critiques of my book, which is he's like, you might not be going far enough in your call for change, which, interesting point. But Chris's book is more about how do we change the way the military fights, military organization, the application of technology, new operational concepts, these kinds of critical issues, which are sort of, one step over, which are really important. But again, that's the kind of place where I have a lot of sympathy for what Chris is saying. I mean, my heart is there with Chris. But A, I'm not an expert on that stuff. And B, I'm also conscious of the counterpoint to Chris, which is, we're not always sure this stuff's going to work. When is it mature? Have we figured out the concept for employment? And, meanwhile, we've got these things, you retire, for instance, I think the cruisers, for instance, or the SSGNs, but then it's like, well, where do those VLS tubes go or come from? And how do we cover down in the sort of near term? So I think that's a very important debate, but I'm not sure I have too much to add to that.
Well, thank you for that. Question from Captain Gary Schnurpush. In general, the U.S. is arguably not very good at establishing and preserving strong partnerships in Asia. Are we doing anything correctly to deny the red hegemon?
The best thing for our relationships in Asia is Xi Jinping. I mean, again, I'm a realist, so countries tend to act in their self-interest and they tend to respond to threats, not positively. But Edward Luttwak has made this point very eloquently that actually are probably kind of some, I think, weak policy in the 2012 to 2016 timeframe actually helped catalyze countries to get more suspicious about China. And I mean, our relationship with India is transformed. And it's not because Modi likes us more than his predecessors, it's because they have a big problem. Japan, I mean, Abe it was just the other day, was publicly talking about nuclear sharing. So I actually think our relationships in Asia are actually pretty good relative. I mean, and they were a lot less scratchy or sort of tempestuous or what's the word I'm looking for? Turbulent during the Trump administration. There was a lot more sort of solidity, if you will, than in Europe. But I think, I go into this a lot in the book. I mean, I don't think we should be trying to create an Asian NATO. actually, frankly, if we were in Europe, if we were redoing Europe, I don't think I would recreate NATO. It's like more work than it's, it's not. And like, why would you bring Portugal in to NATO? And he's, it doesn't, and you're giving him a veto, it doesn't. So, what I think that's why I use this anti-hegemonic coalition. There may be elements within it that have a multilateral element, like the Japan, US, Australia might become a triangle rather than just a hub and spoke. That could be good. But I think the most important thing we can do for our alliances in Asia is implement a strategy of denial, because then they'll say on their own interest is to not be under China's boot. The question they're going to face is that prudent? And the most important thing is to have a military strategy. We also need to have a regional economic strategy, which is a whole different story. My basic view on that is we're going to have to go through the valley of, well, not valley. How do I put this? I think some of our elites probably blew our government's credibility on free trade for a while, and we're going to need some political leaders who have credibility on that front to come through and explain, and who are persuaded that having a kind of, at least in our bloc, a kind of a freer trade area to match China's scale is very important. Because Australia, for instance, is under economic sanctions right now. They need help. So anyway, that's a whole different story that I'm not a particularly interesting voice on. But
here's a question from GK Allen Jr. from the Joint Staff. Where does day-to-day strategic competition fit in? Do we solely focus on preparing for limited war?
Yeah, well, it's a great question from the Joint Staff. Basically, and again, sometimes I put things clearer than truth, but basically, I think we should be preparing for war and not worrying too much about strategic competition. Because actually, what the Russian invasion of Ukraine is showing is dramatic events tend not to happen. Dramatic changes tend not to happen without the direct application of military force. I think my experience in the Pentagon, it drove me up the wall, was there was way too much focus on competition and on the gray zone. And I don't think it matters that much. Like, I don't think China's going to get Taiwan to do anything via gray zone. Probably counterproductive ultimately. And where it matters is probably in Taiwan's ability to respond at the level of high-end warfare. And the thing about the Joint Staff is, what I think the Joint Staff, what we need is, obviously can't fight by services. Obviously, the thing about global integration that was so right was we need a global perspective, but we need the global perspective to implement the strategy, to be prepared for war, to avoid it. And yes, there's going to go things that are going on in peacetime, obviously, but that's why we have a State Department. That's why we have an intelligence community, Treasury, whatever else, commerce, right? The military's job and the unique ability of the military is to be ready. So whenever there's like, I was in a debate with somebody the other day who was saying, oh, we got to keep this exercise in the Southeast Asian country. And I was like, that itself, plus the other million things, are going to decrement readiness. And those forces aren't going to 29 Palms, or, they're not going to Top Gun or whatever. They're out there, and look at what's happening to the 7th Fleet. And the platforms are being used. So basically, I think that people should be focusing on warfighting above all. That doesn't mean that it's only about probability of kills, but it's like, and I think this was the kind of the Secretary Mattis had, like, sharpening the edge, like getting that competitive edge of like getting people ready for the fight. That's going to be the most reliable form of deterrence. Not because also there's always this kind of vague, nebulous sense of what competition is. Like, what is that? Just showing up, or like, no. The core, and this gets back to that imagined wars thing, and how that assessments are dynamic, is the Chinese. I'm sure. I would bet you a lot of money that the Chinese are like, every week or whatever, month in the PLA and CMC, they're probably like, here's a situation on Taiwan, and every day we want that assessment. And there's nothing that we're doing, send a ship through the Taiwan Strait, okay, but the accumulation of all those activities is what's caused us to lose the military advantage. Not to mention the wars in the Middle East and all that stuff, but sequestration, of course. But that's not the purpose of the military. During the Cold War, my favorite example of this is like, during the Cold War, we actually used the military a lot less, other than in Vietnam and Korea, for these kind of peripheral activities, assurance, these kinds of things. You know, the archetypal movie of like our most, I mean, the biggest military success in a way in American history is the later part of the Cold War, when we deterred war and the enemy collapsed. That's like the best thing. That's better than World War II. Lots of people died in World War II. What is the archetypal movie of the late Cold War? It's Top Gun. It's Top Gun because guys are going to a training school to pretend to fight Russians so the Russians can see that it would be a bad idea. You know, meanwhile, the archetypal movie of the last 10 years is SEALs in Afghanistan. And that's like, okay, I mean, heroic, but like, that's not the core of what we want our military to be doing. And so that's what, you know, I mean, my message always to the Joint Staff has been and is like, war fighting first. And always have that connected logic to, are we improving our readiness for Taiwan contingency, nuclear deterrence, or the low-cost counterterrorism? And then push back on the policy, on the civilians, you know, who are saying, oh, I need this military option here. And there. Look, there are costs here, not always the can-do attitude.
Right, that's what economists call the opportunity cost.
Exactly, there you go.
Do you have time for one more question?
Sure.
The last question then is from Peter Scharfman. If we focus on frustrating the adversary's best strategy, the adversary may turn to its second best strategy. For example, in World War I, the British Navy frustrated the German ambition to win surface control of the North Sea, but were initially quite unprepared for U-boats attacking merchant shipping. Should we not think about multiple threats?
Spot on. So, I mean, by definition, if you solve the best strategy, it's better than it's better to have to deal with the second best strategy. But the second best strategy could also be very difficult, especially when, you know, you're Great Britain, you're facing Imperial Germany. It's not like you're dealing with a much smaller power. So I think the answer here, and this is actually where I'm thinking in my head as I'm working on a study on this right now with a friend and colleague, is you know, I think China's best strategy would be a very localized war around Taiwan, where they'd wrap it up. Probably actually what Putin was going for in the first stage. Hey, look, whoa, what just happened? Like, oh, I guess there's a new reality. You know what? There's nothing we can do about it. And if we make a big deal out of it, it's going to be embarrassing. I guess we'll just go along with it. You know, that's the best strategy for Red, right? So I think I guess that would, if I had to bet, that's what Putin was originally going for. Second best strategy is achieve your goals, bludgeon the heck out of the defenders, but get everybody angry at you. That's what Putin's doing. I think the problem is with China, they may be much better positioned to pull it off. I think what their second strategy might be is, we're not going to be able to fight a purely localized war because we'll lose, because we're assuming the Americans are going to come in. And if we narrow the scope of the war too much, they'll have too much of advantages because they'll have impunity to whack us from range and so forth. And they'll be able to operate from bases in Japan and the Philippines, stuff like that. Okay, if you're a PLA planner, you say, well, if I know that's going to happen, I'm going to anticipate that and go big early, in a sense like the Japanese did. But the difference with the Japanese is Japan was 1/10 the size of the American GDP in 1941. China and we are the same. Bigger shipbuilding industry, you know, a lot better industrial, heavy industry. So I think where they might be going, and this is supported by, you know, the commercial imagery of the Chinese doing practice tests against what's obviously American ships or bases or aircraft hangars or whatever in the Western desert. That, I think, is their second best strategy. Just because it's their second best strategy doesn't mean they can't make it work. So to your point, I think we also have to be prepared for that. And then we should be conscious of the dynamic. In a sense, the overall political strategy is not radically different, but because their political goal demands might actually be the same. They might wage a bigger war and only demand Taiwan, but it would reverberate throughout the coalition, or it might pull those demands frontward. And actually, that's not necessarily bad. If China's, so I mean, the good thing about this is if they have to go big, then they're going to attack a lot more people and look a lot more aggressive. They're also going to feel like, if I've done all of this, I better get more than just Taiwan, which is going to make them seem more aggressive, which is going to bring more countries in. So this is, if you're interested, I go into this in chapter 10 on the binding strategy a lot, because I think this may be where things are heading, but not an easy not an easy, but I think we can thread that needle, at least theoretically. Whether we'll actually do it, I don't know, but theoretically we can thread that needle by having a resilient posture and capabilities from range, and actually exacerbate their problems. Because not only would they like necessarily have to hit Japan, but if maybe we're using civilian airfields in Japan or even like roads, well, then they have to hit those. And then suddenly they're like, exactly what the Russians are facing now, they're bombarding civilian areas. And now everybody's like, these guys are pariahs. And that puts a real problem for them.
And so many things to talk about, so many aneurysms snapping here. But ladies and gentlemen, that's all we have time for today. I think it behooves us all to keep this critical discussion going in whatever media you utilize, and share your thoughts and insights within the community. For now, let's please join me in thanking Bridge for sharing his insights with us today. And Bridge, when you develop that diplomatic, military, and economic strategy the nation needs to navigate a projected competition with great power rivals, please let me print it in Prism.
Thank you. I'm glad. Great to talk with you, Mike, and great to talk with everybody on the line. And if I can be of further help to people, or people want to continue the conversation, our website is www.themarathoninitiative.org, and you can email me there.
Thank you for that, Bridge. Let me also thank the Strategic Multi-Layer Assessment Team, Nicole, Mariah, Todd. Thank you so much for your support. And I'd also like to thank the NDU leadership for empowering us to succeed. And I thank you all for joining us. Please stay safe, stay strong, and stay in touch. This is Michael McCloudjic for NDU signing off.